Now, we're going to go back to the beginning, which for me was 2005. In that year, Jill Bennett, who you may know as BBC Radio Norfolk's West Norfolk producer, decided that it was 100 years since Vaughan Williams came to King's Lynn, where she lived, and it was 200 years since Norfolk's other great son, or Norfolk's greatest son, defeated the Spanish and French fleet off the south coast of Spain. So we did a Trafalgar and a Vaughan Williams concert, and we had to turn people away. It was so popular. We had to do it again in another pub's upstairs room, and again it was completely full, and we had to do it a third time. So we decided that there was obviously a great deal of interest in the subject of Vaughan Williams coming to King's Lynn, and the three of us sat down and a few years later decided that we would produce the definitive book about Vaughan Williams in King's Lynn. Well, the book's not out yet, but it should be out this year. And the story, very roughly, is that we divided the work up into three parts. Jill Bennett would talk or write about Vaughan Williams' use of these folk songs in his works, notably, of course, the Norfolk Rhapsodies and other pieces. A lady called Liz James, who some of you may have heard of, had already written about The Captain's Apprentice, one of the songs that Vaughan Williams noted. She was a librarian in King's Lynn and knew the place really well. She was going to write about the singers and the background, because the community that Vaughan Williams specifically went to was called the North End, and it was a fishing community, and it was like a village within King's Lynn. People who married out of the community were often frowned upon. It was a very self-sufficient, very fiercely independent area of Lynn. And I was going to do the songs. And what surprised me when we were doing this concert was that I could not find a definitive list of how many songs Vaughan Williams had collected, how many songs there were altogether, and so on. And I'm a list person, I'm afraid, so I thought, right, I'll make a list. And I ended up with 86 songs and 4 tunes, which was quite a surprise. Now, they were all in a book. It was a book called The Works of Vaughan Williams by Michael Kennedy. It came out in 1964, and he had quite assiduously gone through Vaughan Williams' manuscript books and written down all the songs that he found in there, in the right order, noting the place and the singer. But it was all part of this huge tome of the official sort of list of Vaughan Williams' works. He worked on it with Vaughan Williams before Vaughan Williams died. And so I started with that, and as I say, ended up with about 90 items. We then sang some of these, and then I started to collect words. Now, Vaughan Williams, I was having this discussion with somebody a little earlier, he was really only interested in the tunes. That's 100 and odd years ago, and things were different then. But he was after what he called the soul of English music. He was a young composer trying to make his way, trying not to write German music, which was all the everybody's favourite at the time, but there were English composers like Parry and Elgar and so on, but he wanted his own style, and he joined the committee of the English Folk Song Society in 1904 when it was more or less moribund, and he went in 1905, he started in December 1903 noting folk songs, and he went all the way through 1904, and then in 1905 came to King's Lynn in January. Now, one phrase you're going to hear a lot, I'm afraid, is "we don't know why." The problem is he didn't keep a diary. He wrote very little about his experiences afterwards. He gave a couple of talks when he mentioned things, but we really don't know much about why he was here. Now, my theory is this. When the Folk Song Society first started, the first journal came out in 1899. The secretary was a lady called Kate Lee. Unfortunately, she became ill and had to give up the job, and the society was more or less defunct. And then Lucy Broadwood took over as secretary. She was a bit of a live wire. Vaughan Williams and Cecil Sharp were co-opted onto the committee, and things took off in a big way. And of course, they continued. Then in 1931, they joined with the Dance Society to become the FDUS we all know and love today. Kate Lee, in 1897, came to Norfolk on holiday. And she went specifically to North Norfolk and specifically to Wells. And she went down to the harbour and she said to the fishermen, "Do you know any songs?" Which is probably not the best way of starting, but she did. And they said, "Blast, ma'am, no, we don't know any songs. You want to go to Sheringham." They sing in Sheringham. So as far as I know, she didn't go to Sheringham. Perhaps she didn't have a bike, I don't know. But she certainly went to Baconsthorpe, which is not far from Wells. And as she was walking through Baconsthorpe, she heard this bloke whistling. And she thought, that sounds like a nice little folk song. And she went up to him and said, "Pardon me, young man," you know, the accent. "What is that you're whistling?" He said, "Well, that's a dance tune, ma'am." She said, "Could you whistle it again while I write it down?" And he did, and she did. His name was Joe Skillings. And she wrote this tune down. And she said, What's it called?" And he said, "Ma'am, that's called the High Road to Lynn." And she thought, "Oh, well, we're not far from King's Lynn. It must be a local tune." So she wrote High Road to Lynn. And sure enough, in the first journal, she made a horrible blunder. She printed this tune. And it's about number 3 or 4 in the journal, the third or fourth thing that the English Folk Song Society published. It turned out to be not a folk song, it was a dance tune, and it was Scottish. And it was actually called The High Road to Linton. But Joe Skillings, coming from Baconsthorpe, that High Road to Linton. And that's all she got. So she made a bit of a blunder there. But she had in her head, and she printed it in the first journal, that they sang songs in Sheringham. Now, whether that was one of the things that brought Vaughan Williams to North Norfolk or not, I don't know. It's very, very difficult to tell. We just don't know. The other possible reason is this. When the Folk Song Society got going, they put an article in a national paper saying, "We are the English Folk Song Society. If you know or hear of other people singing English folk songs, please write them down and send them to us. If you can't, we'll come and write them down for you," which is a bit of a dangerous thing to do, but they did. Now, we don't know if there was an answer to that or not. There might have been, and it might have been the Reverend John Newnham, who was the vicar at Tilney All Saints and Tilney St Lawrence. If you don't know your Fens geography, they're about 4 miles from King's Lynn to the southwest. And he may have answered this letter, and Vaughan Williams may have gone there for that reason. On the other hand, Lucy Broadwood might have said, "Rafe, Norfolk, go." We just don't know. So the first place he went to was not King's Lynn, it was the 2 Tilneys. He may have had his bike with him. His wife Ursula said in her biography of him that he took his bike when looking for folk songs a lot of the time. He could have got off his bike, off the train in King's Lynn from London and cycled to Tilney. There was a railway line in those days. It went through Clenchwarton and it went over to the west, the Midland and Great Northern. He might have got the train to Clenchwarton, just don't know. But that's where he started, in the Tilneys. And one of the people he met was Stephen Pole. All right? The Reverend Newnham introduced him to 2 people, his verger and Stephen Pole in St Lawrence, who was both a singer and played fiddle for the local dancers. Chris will now introduce us to one of Stephen Pole's dance tunes. Chris.
Yes, one of the 4 that was taken down was Trip to the Cottage, which is a very well-known jig, country dance tune, very common throughout Britain and Ireland, and actually is used for the dance of the same name, which is a sort of circle dance with a great deal of progression running through it. And this is the version of the tune, of which there are many, which came from Stephen Pole.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Chris will be playing the other 3 tunes, you'll be pleased to know, so it's not me all the way. You'll get some music as well. So we got the 3 of us working. I'm trying to note the songs. The first thing I did was went with Jill Bennett down to the British Library, and in those days, round about 2008, I think it was, we went, you could actually get his manuscript books in your hands, and that was essential because there was so much information on the empty pages. I know that sounds daft, but there were numbers of pages and so on, and it gave me lots of clues as to where he went, when he went, who he met and so on, which book he had with him, because he went to 2 main places. He went to the North End, this almost closed community of fishermen, but he also crossed King's Lynn. If you know the place, you go across the walks and you come to Exton's Road, and that was the workhouse. Now, I did have some pictures, unfortunately I'm unable to show them to you, but the workhouse was the biggest civic structure in King's Lynn at the time. It was enormous. It's still there, and it's now National Health Service offices. But he went to these 2 different places. He had 2 different manuscript books, and I found it very, very interesting to sort of do all the detective work and find out what he was up to. After a while, the 3 of us started thinking about how we were going to publish this. And it became quite obvious fairly soon that we did need 2 different ways of doing it. The book was fine, but I wanted something that would lay flat on the table, that people could read. They wanted a spine, so it sat in the shelf and you could see what it was. I wanted, having tried to teach Norfolk children the stave and to sing for 30 years in various schools around the county, I realised how difficult that is and how most people don't read music. I really wanted a sound that they could listen to the tune, so they could listen to the tune. And it became obvious that we had to do 2 different things. So we separated quite amicably, and they continued, and their books should be out this year. And they will be talking about the people, the place, and the use of the tunes in his works. I produced a CD-ROM. To be accurate, Rod Stradling of Musical Traditions produced a CD-ROM. This is actually number 2, but I produced the King's Lynn one as number 1. And on here, Rod Stradling did something really clever. I gave him all the PDFs, the photographs of the tunes and that. He put a bit of technical wizardry on there, so anybody's computer can play the tune to them. Normally you can't do that unless you've got musical software. He did that. It's brilliant. He also, on the songs with a really long number of verses, he split the screen so that the tune stays there. You can see it, you can hear it, and you can scroll the words up and down so that you could sing the words and the tune's still there. Brilliantly done. I couldn't have done it. So I want to say thank you very much to Rod Stradling. Unfortunately, the number 1 CD-ROM is now out of print. And Rod has retired. He's not making them anymore. But I rang him up, and he's a lovely chap. He said, you go ahead and do your own version of it. And so I do have them here if anybody's interested. This is exactly the same as the CD-ROM that came out in 2014, but it's produced by me. And this is Rod's. I've got some of those still. This covers the rest of Norfolk. Vaughan Williams' 3 other trips, 1908, 1910, 1911. So I went ahead and did my thing with the CD-ROM, and Liz and Jill continued to work. The nice thing about it was we continued to meet in True's Yard, which is the museum in King's Lynn, and they do wonderful homemade cakes and tea. So we sort of meet regularly. I get the bus from Norwich, and they wander over, and we have a chat about things. So let's have another tune, shall we? Okay. Chris, are you ready? Thank you.
Right, this one's Ladies' Triumph, which is a very well-known country dance tune again, which goes perfectly with the dance of the same name. Very, very widespread, and in fact, it is mentioned in Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy, for example, and was one of the tunes that he and his family used to play. So it has very wide currency across the whole of the British Isles. So, excuse me, this is Ladies' Triumph.
Thank you, Chris. Now, there's another vicar, although at the time he was only a curate in this story, and it's the Reverend Alfred Huddle. Just a very quick word about King's Lynn. The main church, the minster, is St Margaret's on the Saturday marketplace. They needed a separate chapel for the fishing community, and so they built St Nicholas, which is an enormous chapel. It's not a church, it's a chapel. It's now used for concerts and things, and people who have North End connections can get married or have their burial service there, but nobody else can. And this is the place where Reverend Alfred Huddle was in charge. Now, he was a curate, never a vicar, because the vicar was at St Margaret's. His story is, I found, absolutely fascinating, and I've just Alex from the East Anglian Traditional Music Trust here has just put onto the website the story of Alfred Huddle. And very briefly, he was a leather worker. He didn't have any money. He didn't have any family connections. He wasn't the number 3 son who went into the church after the Parliament and the army. He just decided, having trained and qualified as a leather worker, he wanted to become ordained. And he was so lucky in that there was a college had just started in Cambridge for people like him who couldn't afford to have the lodgings, and he went to Cambridge and he got his BA a couple of years later, and the college folded. He was just in the right time to do that. So he was obviously a very dedicated sort of person, and he'd been there about 4 years in the North End when this young composer turned up. Now, we don't know how they met. It's possible they met quite by accident. It's possible that John Newnham, the vicar at Tilney, had sent him there. No idea. But Alfred Huddle was absolutely the right person. About 4 years, just before he got to King's Lynn, there was something of a religious revival in the town amongst the fishermen. And there were a lot of them went to church. It was very, very full. And Alfred Huddle was very popular with the fishermen. He was a very down-to-earth, honest sort of person. He took Vaughan Williams into the fishing community, into the North End, and it's just as well he did, because there's not much of it left. But what there was an absolute maze of little passages and alleyways and courtyards and things that was cleared away in 1963. But he would have got lost, Vaughan Williams. He would never have come out again. But Alfred Huddle took him to Dougie Carter, was the first one, because those are the first ones in his book, and introduced him to Dougie Carter, who sang him a song that, it's no exaggeration to say, changed Vaughan Williams' life. It was a song called The Captain's Apprentice, although Dougie Carter called it something else, Apprentice Boy. And Vaughan Williams was absolutely knocked out by this tune. And although it was only the second one, and he went on to get 80 odd more, that was the one that he took and put into the first Norfolk Rhapsody. Now, you have to imagine him in his hotel on Blackfriars Road in King's Lynn. He's done a week. On Saturday, he finished his last song. On Sunday, he's still in his hotel because he wrote a letter. And what's he doing? He doesn't know anybody in King's Lynn. I think he was looking through his manuscript book. I think he was singing over the tunes. And I think he was thinking, now what can I do with this? Chris. That's what he actually wrote in his manuscript book. But he then, I think, thought to himself, sorry, is it all right if I do this? Yeah. He then thought to himself, I want that on the viola. And this is what it would sound like on a viola. those of you who know Vaughan Williams' work will recognise that as the start of the Norfolk Rhapsody. I think he was writing first few notes about that tune on that one day he had, or at least we know at least one day in the hotel after he'd finished his work. But there was another tune that captivated him because as a composer of classical pieces, and I'm sure you know, there's often two different tunes contrasting in the same piece. And this was the other one. I'm sure you recognise that as On Board in '98, a jolly little song about somebody press-ganged, sent around the world in the Navy, and ends up singing instead of On Board in '98, but he can't do anything else because he's now 98 years old. It's one of the few folk songs that actually ends with a laugh. Most of the time, people get killed, or everybody gets killed, or something like that. But that was the contrasting tune that he used. Now, there's an interesting idea going about. Michael Kennedy talked about it in 1964. Other people have mentioned it since. That this was the first Norfolk Rhapsody, and you've just heard the second theme, the lively theme. He wrote two other Norfolk Rhapsodies. The first one was performed first at the Proms in 1906, so only less than 2 years after he'd noted the tune, it was actually performed, conducted by Henry Wood and the Proms. Next year, 1907, in Cardiff, they did the first performances of the second and third Norfolk Rhapsodies, and the second one also had that tune in it. And the third one has been lost. It was performed once, and whether Vaughan Williams didn't like it or not, or whether it was just lost, I don't know. But there is a theory that this was intended to be the Norfolk Symphony, that he may well, if he'd had time or the inclination, have continued and actually put the three bits together to make a symphony. So all of those tunes would have been from Norfolk. Sadly, that's not quite what happened. It would have been lovely. One other tune that I'll mention from a chap called Joe Anderson, and if you've ever seen that famous picture of Joe Anderson, Dougie Carter and Reverend Alfred Newnham there's a copy in True's Yard. Joe was the other singer that Vaughan Williams really liked. More of his tunes were used by Vaughan Williams than of any other singer, and he sang probably more tunes, I think, than anybody else. Joe Anderson sang him a song called Young Henry the Poacher, a song about young Henry who went poaching and got caught, got sent off to Australia. Pretty grim tale. Vaughan Williams thought, oh, that's a nice hymn tune. We'll have that one. And I can imagine him sitting in his hotel working out the harmony. Now, that's not easy. I've tried this myself with some of the other tunes from King's Lynn. You've got to write a harmony that the congregation can sing. You've got to write a tune the congregation can sing, harmony that the choir can sing, but it's got to be different to your standard 4-part hymn harmony because it's a folk melody. And this particular one, and a lot of folk melodies, I'm going to use that horrible word in a moment, they are modal. Right, now we don't need to go into all the complications of that, but it suffices to say that most hymn tunes aren't there in a major key. He wanted to make this thing sound different, and he did. He did a lovely job. I would have at this point have put the on the screen the page from the New English Hymnal 1906 with a hymn called O God of Earth and Altar. It's a G.K. Chesterton poem. tune from Joe Anderson, harmony by Vaughan Williams, and it was very, very well received in 1906. Vaughan Williams was the musical editor of the New English Hymnal. In 1926, he was a musical editor of Songs of Praise, which has probably been much, much more popular than the New English Hymnal. And it's a very, very common hymn book. And that tune is in there as well. And I have to give him credit, Vaughan Williams, because he used a lot of English folk tunes for hymns. They're pretty simple things, some of them, but he makes them sound folky, but he always credits English traditional. There are 49 English traditional tunes in the New English Hymnal, and by curious coincidence, there are 49 in Songs of Praise as well. And they're a fantastic source. If you want some folk melodies, get a hymn book, and that's where you'll find them. Vaughan Williams did it, of course. So those, again, I would have put some things up on the screen. I had a picture of his manuscript book with the Captain's Apprentice in it, and it's scrawled all over the place because the way Dougie Carter sang it, it was different every verse. And I can't sort of explain it all, but Vaughan Williams had a wonderful way of writing the tune. As he was listening to it, he wrote it down on the first stave of a 6-stave manuscript book. And when he got to the end of the line, he didn't go to the second line down, he went to the 4th line down. And he usually managed to get the rest of the tune in there, which meant that he had 2 staves under each half of the tune where he could write what we call the variants. And that was very, very useful because they were exactly there. But with the Captain's Apprentice, they're all over the place. And in fact, he had to go back to it later and say, no, use this one as the main tune, this one's a variant, and so on. It's quite an interesting thing to see what he had to do to make Dougie Carter's tunes singable, accessible, and so on. We'll go now to the 3rd tune from Stephen Pole, please, if we may, Chris. Sorry.
Noted down as the low-backed car, it's more commonly known as the Nutting Girl, and as such it carries the words of the song The Nutting Girl, but it's used widely as a country dance tune, and also I believe as a Morris dance tune as well. And because of Vaughan Williams' rather spidery handwriting, it looked for quite a long time and took it at face value that it was probably actually the low-backed cow. But then it turned out there was a popular song called The Low-Backed Car written in the late 19th century, I think, which obviously used the tune, and that's where this particular version got its name from.
Thank you, Chris. Was it in it? Yeah, one more. No, yeah. The low-back car is used in Ireland as a 2-wheel cart for carrying people around. I'm just going to do one more little bit for you. I believe very strongly when I've been doing this research in going to the place, and I found that really very, very useful. One silly example, I walked one day from the North End of King's Lynn, and I walked past the corner where Vaughan Williams Hotel was, and I was on my way to the workhouse. Now, the weekend before he got to King's Lynn, there was a hell of a storm, and King's Lynn was flooded, the fishing boats couldn't get out, and it was still raging while he was there at the start of the week while he was there. As I walked round sort of the corner, walked past the corner of the road, my umbrella blew inside out. And I thought, I wonder if he had an umbrella. And I know that's a silly example, but it's the sort of thing, if you're not actually there, you don't think about it. What was it like for him walking across King's Lynn and all that at that time? The second example I'll give you was this, and it doesn't refer to King's Lynn. The very last song that he got in Norfolk was in 1911 at Scole near Diss. And we know that he got this song from a chap called Woodcock, who was both a publican and a blacksmith. And this is right at the end of my research on his visits. I thought, I'll have to go there, see if I can find, because there's nothing on Google, nothing on the Norfolk Pub's website. Didn't know what I'd find. So I walked through Scole, parked the van up, walked through Scole. I've spotted a building I thought might be the pub, now a private house. No sign of a blacksmith, as you might expect. And I thought, oh, well, let's go home. And I was walking back to the van, and there was a bloke loading his car up in his garden. His house was a beautiful black timber framed white cottage. All the old English plants in the garden. He had a lovely wrought iron gate for the car, but next to the gate was a kissing gate. And there was a sign on it that said, removed when the bypass was built, the A140, and the right-of-way was extinguished. And he said, and it more or less said, I've saved this, the council was going to chuck it away. If anybody wants it for a footpath, you can have it back. And I thought, that sounds an interesting sort of bloke. I said, excuse me, yes? I said, you don't happen to know where the Greyhound pub was, do you? Yes. I said, you don't happen to know where the smithy was, do you? Yes. And it turned out I had found the village historian with an enormous collection of old postcards, including the Greyhound and the smithy. And in particular, there's one picture which appears in that second CD-ROM. An absolutely beautiful picture. There's the smithy with the church tower behind it, so we could fix exactly where it was. There's a bungalow there now. And on the old Roman road, the Pie Street, the A140, standing in the middle of the road is a bloke with 2 horses and a cart. And there's the smithy and this great cloud of steam because he's just put a shoe on. And he's standing in the middle of the road. It's the most gorgeous picture. I would never have found it if I hadn't just asked, if I hadn't gone there. Dear John Halliday, no longer with us, but he's a great photographer. I got him to come along and photograph these things. And I'd like to give credit to John Hall, who owned the postcards and so on, and let me take a copy of them. But actually being there was quite crucial. And the last thing of all, before we have one more tune from Stephen Pole to finish, having spent a lot of time in King's Lynn, I thought, right, I've got to go and visit the Tilneys. Instead of cycling from my flat up to the bus station in Norwich, getting the bus to King's Lynn, getting off, going to True's Yard and having a cake and a cup of tea, I stayed on the bus with my folding bike. I went to Clenchwarton, the next stop, and I got off there, erected the bike, cycled a couple of miles down to Tilney All Saints, and I took some pictures, and then I cycled across the fence, and I'm in my shorts, and a nice bright sunny March day, pedalling across the fence, and I'm thinking, oh, this is research, is it? Oh, that'll do very nicely, thank you very much. I was having a whale of a time. And again, if I hadn't been there, I wouldn't have gone to the vicarage of Tilney All Saints and thought to myself, shall I take a picture? Yeah, I'll go and ask. I was just about to open the gate to the garden with this nice big lawn, and the door opened of this big old vicarage, and these 2 enormous great dogs came out and started running towards me. I backed off to the other side of the road because being a walker and a cyclist, I'm very wary of dogs. And the lady came out and she saw what was going on, so she pulled the dogs in. I said, did you know that Vaughan Williams might have stayed in your house? She said, no. She said, I knew he came to the village, and she told me where the memorial stone to Reverend Newnham was, and she let me into her garden and take photos of the vicarage, which she called the Old Vic, and then continued by saying, I'm glad it wasn't a rectory. And that was just lovely. Once I'd removed, as you do with these pictures these days, all traces of a bright orange plastic wheelbarrow, that really did look like the vicarage from 1905. So I had a fantastic time doing this. I was paid a compliment. I shouldn't do this because it compliments me. But somebody said that the work I'd done was at an almost forensic level. Well, you had no choice. He didn't write a diary. We don't know why he went where he went. We don't know half the things that he did. I haven't even mentioned Sheringham. He took the train from King's Lynn to Sheringham, changed at Melton Constable, and he spent the day in Sheringham. Don't know why. He only got 2 songs that day when he was averaging 11 in King's Lynn. So thank you very much for listening. I enjoyed talking to you. I was a bit worried about it, but it's a lovely story. And we're going to finish with one more dance tune from Chris. And thanks for this. Thanks to Alex for organising it all as well. Chris. Thank you.
Right, the final tune that was noted down from Stephen Poll was another country dance tune called Gypsies in the Wood. Not particularly common around these parts, but apparently it has been collected out in Cambridgeshire, just outside Cambridge, for molly dancing. But it certainly has a country dance attached to it. Fairly simple, straightforward, long way set dance. So Gypsies in the Wood.